In the 1970s, the city of Bhopal, India, was full of optimism. It was growing, industrializing, and welcoming new opportunities that promised to lift thousands out of poverty. When the American chemical company Union Carbide Corporation opened a pesticide plant on the outskirts of the city, it was seen as a symbol of progress and modern development. The factory, run by its subsidiary, Union Carbide India Limited, produced a pesticide called Seven, widely used across India's vast agricultural lands. But hidden beneath this promise of prosperity was a deadly vulnerability. The key ingredient in Seven's production was methyl isocyanate, or MIC, a highly toxic, volatile chemical that had to be stored under extremely controlled conditions. Even a small leak could be lethal. Despite this danger, safety standards at the Bhopal plant were significantly weaker than those at Union Carbide's American facilities. Internal reports from the time showed that the company had knowingly approved cost-cutting measures that compromised critical safety systems. By the early 1980s, financial pressures mounted, and corners were cut even further. Skilled workers were laid off and replaced with less trained staff. Routine maintenance was delayed or ignored. Minor gas leaks became common, often dismissed as manageable incidents. Equipment that should have been replaced or repaired was left to deteriorate. What had once been a state-of-the-art facility was now a dangerous maze of corroded pipes and failing machinery. The plant's safety infrastructure, meant to prevent a catastrophic leak, was slowly dismantled by negligence. The refrigeration system, designed to keep the MIC tanks cool and stable, was shut off to save electricity. The vent gas scrubber, which could have neutralized escaping toxic gas, was out of service. The flare tower, meant to burn off dangerous emissions, was offline, missing a key section of piping. Each failed safeguard meant one less line of defense between the city and disaster. Inside the factory sat 3 large storage tanks filled with methyl isocyanate. The most notorious of them, Tank 610, held roughly 40 tons of the chemical. With no active cooling, minimal supervision, and non-functional emergency systems, it was a silent catastrophe waiting to happen. Workers noticed small irregularities in pressure readings and occasional leaks, but their warnings went unheeded. To those working the night shift, these conditions had become normal. They didn't realize they were standing on top of a chemical time bomb. Union Carbide's decision to prioritize profit over safety had built a trap with no escape. All it would take was one small mistake, one moment of oversight, to unleash a disaster that would forever change the city of Bhopal and the world's understanding of industrial safety. It was the night of December 2nd, 1984, when routine maintenance at the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal turned into a catastrophe. Around 10:30 that evening, a small group of workers began flushing pipes with water to clear debris. What they did not realize was that water had inadvertently entered one of the methyl isocyanate storage tanks, Tank 610. The chemical reaction that followed was rapid and uncontrollable. As the water mixed with the toxic gas, the temperature and pressure inside the tank began to rise dramatically. By midnight, workers noticed the gauges climbing far beyond safe levels, but by then it was too late. Inside the tank, a violent chemical reaction was underway, producing heat, carbon dioxide, and enough pressure to rupture the system. The safety valves burst open, and the deadly gas began to escape into the air. The flare tower that was supposed to burn off the toxic fumes had been shut down for maintenance. The scrubber, which could have neutralized the leak, was out of service. Within minutes, a dense white cloud of methyl isocyanate began pouring out of the plant and drifting across the sleeping city. At first, people living near the factory thought it was a fire. Then came the burning in their eyes, the coughing, and the choking that made it impossible to breathe. The gas was heavier than air, so it hugged the ground, spreading silently through the narrow streets of Bhopal. Within an hour, it had blanketed much of the southern part of the city, where tens of thousands of people lived in tightly packed homes. Those who tried to run found themselves disoriented by the thick, acrid cloud that stung their lungs and blinded them. Inside the plant, chaos reigned. Operators tried desperately to understand what was happening as alarms wailed. Many of them were unaware of the full danger of methyl isocyanate exposure. The control room filled with panic as they realized that nearly all of the emergency systems had failed. By the time they attempted to spray water into the air to disperse the gas, the leak had already reached an unstoppable scale. Outside, Bhopal was descending into horror. Families awoke to the sound of screaming animals dying in the streets, and the overwhelming stench of chemicals. People stumbled through the darkness, clutching their throats and gasping for air. Within just a few hours, entire neighborhoods were overtaken by the invisible poison. Hospitals began to fill with victims, but even doctors did not know what they were dealing with or how to treat it. By the time dawn broke on December 3rd, the damage had already been done. The deadly gas had spread across more than 40 square kilometers of the city. Thousands were dead or dying, and tens of thousands more were severely injured. The world would soon awaken to the horrifying reality that one of the worst industrial disasters in history had just unfolded in the heart of India. When the sun rose over Bhopal on December 3rd, 1984, the city had transformed into a nightmare. The streets were eerily quiet except for the cries of the injured and the sound of sirens. Bodies lay scattered along roads, railway tracks, and near water pumps where people had tried to wash the gas from their faces. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones while the air remained thick with the lingering chemical odor. The early morning haze made it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead, and the full scale of the tragedy was still unknown. Hospitals were overwhelmed within hours. Doctors and nurses, many without proper protective gear, worked frantically to treat victims who arrived coughing, choking, and barely conscious. Most had no idea what gas they were dealing with. Some thought it was chlorine. Others suspected ammonia. Without clear information from the Union Carbide plant, medical staff resorted to washing patients' eyes with water and giving oxygen to those struggling to breathe. Supplies quickly ran out, oxygen cylinders were emptied, beds were filled, and hallways became makeshift treatment areas. By mid-morning, authorities began to realize the disaster's true magnitude. Reports indicated that thousands were dead and tens of thousands were suffering severe respiratory and eye injuries. Many victims died within hours of exposure, their lungs filled with fluid from chemical burns. The gas had spread silently through densely populated neighborhoods like Jayaprakash, Nagar, Chayankage, Holayapa, and Kazi Camp, areas that bordered the factory walls. Even days later, the smell of chemicals clung to the air, and birds fell lifeless from trees. Confusion spread among the survivors. Rumors circulated that the gas was still leaking, prompting waves of people to flee the city on foot. Thousands tried to board overcrowded trains heading out of Bhopal, carrying what little they could. Others sought shelter in temples and schools far from the factory zone. The government, initially slow to respond, began dispatching military units to help with evacuation and relief efforts. Trucks and buses transported the injured to hospitals in neighboring towns, but the damage was already irreversible. Union Carbide officials at first denied the severity of the situation. Representatives claimed the gas was only an irritant and that exposure would cause minor discomfort. But the evidence on the ground told a different story. Entire families had perished overnight, livestock lay dead in fields, and crops near the factory had turned yellow and brittle. Water sources were contaminated, making recovery even more difficult for the survivors who remained. As news of the disaster spread, journalists from across India and abroad arrived in Bhopal. Many were unprepared for the devastation they encountered. They described scenes of mass suffering, people blinded, struggling to breathe, and mourning loved ones. The city, once bustling with life, had become a symbol of industrial negligence and human vulnerability. The world was watching, but for the people of Bhopal, the nightmare was far from over. By the end of that day, it was clear that this was not just an accident. It was a human and environmental catastrophe. Hospitals were beyond capacity, morgues were overflowing, and the scale of death was unlike anything India had seen in peacetime. As dusk fell on December 3rd, the survivors faced a grim reality. The gas had cleared, but the disaster's consequences were only beginning. The immediate horror of the gas leak was just the beginning. In the months and years following December 2nd and 3rd, 1984, Bhopal faced a crisis of long-term health effects that would impact generations. Over 500,000 people were exposed to methyl isocyanate, and thousands developed chronic illnesses. Respiratory problems became widespread, with survivors suffering from persistent coughing, bronchitis, and pulmonary fibrosis. Many could no longer work, and entire families were plunged into poverty. Eye injuries were particularly severe. Reports indicated that tens of thousands experienced partial or complete blindness, corneal damage, and chronic irritation. Neurological effects were also common, including tremors, memory loss, and persistent headaches. Children born to women exposed to the gas experienced higher rates of birth defects, developmental delays, and physical abnormalities. Miscarriages increased dramatically in the months following the disaster, and fertility issues plagued survivors for years. The environmental impact compounded human suffering. Toxic chemicals from the plant seeped into the soil and groundwater, contaminating wells that people relied on for drinking water. Tests decades later still showed dangerous levels of carcinogenic substances like mercury and organophosphates. Crops grown near the factory were often unsafe to eat, and local wildlife populations suffered heavy losses. Cleanup efforts began slowly, but the sheer volume of hazardous waste, estimated at tens of thousands of tons, meant that the area remained perilous. Waterborne diseases became another major concern. With safe drinking water scarce, outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and gastrointestinal illnesses surged. Hospitals continued to treat patients for chemical exposure while also addressing these secondary health crises. In addition, mental health issues emerged. Survivors experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety at unprecedented rates. The psychological toll on the community was immense, as people mourned lost family members and struggled with ongoing uncertainty about their health and environment. Legal battles over responsibility and compensation dragged on for decades. The initial settlement of $470 million in 1989 was widely condemned as inadequate, amounting to only a few $100s per victim. Union Carbide, and later Dow Chemical, avoided further liability, leaving many survivors without sufficient support. Activists and NGOs fought tirelessly to demand proper healthcare, clean water, and long-term monitoring of affected populations. Even decades later, the abandoned factory remains a dangerous site. Corroded tanks, broken pipes, and chemical sludge litter the grounds. Attempts to remove or neutralize the waste have been slow and limited, covering only a fraction of the contamination. Local communities continue to rely on contaminated water, and children growing up near the site face higher health risks than the national average. The Bhopal disaster revealed a grim reality. The effects of industrial negligence do not end when the initial accident is over. Health, environment, and livelihoods can be compromised for generations. Survivors continue to fight for justice and remediation, yet the scale of contamination and the complexity of chemical hazards mean that true recovery may never be fully possible. Bhopal became a stark warning of what can happen when corporate shortcuts and regulatory failures intersect with human lives. Decades after the disaster, Bhopal remains a symbol of industrial failure and the human cost of negligence. Despite the passage of time, justice for the victims has been painfully slow and incomplete. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide at the time, was arrested upon arrival in India in December 1984, but was quickly released on bail. He returned to the United States and never faced trial, dying in 2004 without answering for his role. Many Indian courts pursued civil and criminal cases for years, but the wheels of justice turned too slowly to meet the scale of suffering. The 1989 settlement of $470 million was widely criticized as grossly inadequate. For hundreds of thousands of victims, this amounted to just a few $100s per person. Survivors and activist groups have continually pushed for additional compensation and healthcare support, highlighting that many exposed to the gas still live with severe health problems, disabilities, and economic hardship. Dow Chemical, which acquired Union Carbide in 2001, has consistently maintained that no further liability exists, leaving millions of affected people without adequate remediation or medical care. The environmental legacy of the disaster remains equally alarming. The factory site continues to leach toxic chemicals into soil and groundwater. Cleanup efforts have addressed only a fraction of the hazardous waste, and groundwater contamination has exposed an estimated 200,000 people to carcinogenic chemicals. Local NGOs and activists describe the cleanup as a farce, with chemical sludge and corroded tanks still present decades later. This ongoing contamination perpetuates health risks and undermines any attempt at meaningful recovery. Bhopal's impact extends beyond India. The disaster became a global turning point in discussions of industrial safety, environmental regulations, and corporate accountability. International organizations, including the United Nations and the International Labour Organization, have cited Bhopal as a case study in the dangers of inadequate safety standards and regulatory oversight. It also influenced changes in chemical plant design, emergency preparedness, and hazard communication worldwide. Yet the disaster exposes a fundamental injustice. Those most affected are rarely the ones responsible. The people of Bhopal, already economically vulnerable, suffered the full consequences of corporate decisions made thousands of miles away. Entire families were uprooted, children were born with defects, and communities were forced to confront a poisoned environment with minimal support. The human cost is incalculable, and the scars, both physical and psychological, are permanent. Activists and survivors continue to demand justice, healthcare, and environmental remediation. Organizations such as the Bhopal Gas Padit Mahila Udyog Sangathan, Bhopal Gas Affected Women's Organization, work tirelessly to secure medical treatment, legal advocacy, and public awareness. Their fight illustrates that while decades have passed, the struggle for accountability and safety remains unresolved. The Bhopal disaster serves as a chilling reminder that industrial progress without responsibility can have catastrophic consequences. It underscores the need for rigorous safety standards, transparent corporate practices, and strong governmental oversight. The lessons of Bhopal are clear. When lives are treated as expendable in the pursuit of profit, the fallout can last generations. For the survivors and their families, the tragedy is not a historical footnote, it is an ongoing reality. The abandoned plant stands as a rusting monument to failure, a reminder of lives lost and the continuing dangers to those who remain. Bhopal teaches the world that industrial disasters are preventable, but only if accountability, vigilance, and humanity are placed above cost-cutting and negligence.